Well, Dr. Robert Brooks, Bob, thank you very much for joining us here today. It's great to see you again.
And it's great to see you again.
So, we decided we're going to talk about ADHD, and I was channeling the conversation I've had with so many parents, I'm sure you have as well, which is my child has just got the diagnosis of ADHD. I feel like a relief or maybe worried, but I have no idea what to do next. So Dr. Brooks, what is next?
Well, the first very important step is even getting the diagnosis. And I'll start by telling you a story about why that is so important. I was giving a talk to a parents group, and most of the parents had kids with learning or attentional problems. And what happened is, as I often say to my audiences, especially parents, if your kids want to write to me, I love to get their letters. I love to get their stories. And I left it at that, and then I flew home the next day, and literally a day after that, I get this email, which was, in one sense, it was funny at first, but it was very profound to come up. It says, "Dear Dr. Brooks, my mother heard you speak a couple of nights ago. She said you need some pen pals. I'm here for you." And I didn't quite put it that way, Patty, as you might mention. But then he asked, and it directly ties to your question. He says, you'll see why. He said, "Why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD?" And what a powerful statement. And I know I'm only going to be seeing this or contacting this child through email. And so I said, what do I say to him? One, I know his mother had told me that he is going to see a therapist. And it really had to do with what's next in part. I said to him, because he had just gotten the diagnosis, I said, it's very important that you know now that you have ADHD. And then I added, but now that you know, there are things your parents can do. There are things your teachers can do. There are things other professionals can do. And I paused, and then I said, and there are things you can do. Because, as you know, my whole philosophy about resilience is we want kids or adults to feel some sense of personal control over this. So I wrote him this, and I said, again, I emphasize, and there are things you can do and others can do, so that that diagnosis can be helpful. And I also said, and if you have questions about the diagnosis, certainly to speak to your parents and to your doctor. So I get back a note from the kids basically saying thank you, but the mother wrote, and she said he really seemed so much happier. And I kept in touch with the mother for a few months, and things seemed to be going better. And then, and I want to talk about this, and I know I'm going on a little because it was a very powerful experience for me, the impact of even one comment to a child and how the impact it could have, or to the mother. 13 or 14 years later, I'm giving a talk, and it was an all-morning keynote, and there were kids, well, I'll say they're young adults, and parents were there, and at the end, this mother comes over to me, and she said, "Thanks so much for using my son as an example here. It was so helpful." And I said, "Who are you?" And I'll just call the kid Danny. And she said, "I'm Danny's mother. You wrote to him 9 years ago." And to make a long story short, he was now 23. I asked her, "How's he doing?" And you always get a little nervous because I didn't want to hear, "Oh my God, he's this." And he said, and she said to me, she said, he's graduating from college and he's doing very well. And thank you for writing to him." So I bring all of this, I know it's a long story, I bring all of it up to say what's next for me has to do with once you have the diagnosis, then you have at least some guideposts about what you can do. And that could mean certainly working with the schools, thinking about your child, how you want to respond to them, and thinking about what their strengths or islands of competence are. So it really encompasses a great deal. So I always say to people, the first step is to be aware and to get the diagnosis. The next step then is to think about who are the professionals in your life who could be of help, how could you be an advocate for your child, and what are things the schools could do to accommodate your child's ADHD.
I love the story. It was
Mm.
well worth telling because I
Oh,
think it
thank you.
speaks to an emotion that a lot of parents feel, which is fear of the future and what
Mhm.
happens to your kid. And, most of the time kids turn out just fine. It's always hard to predict, obviously, but that's heartwarming. I'm wondering if also there's one emotion is fear, but another feeling is overwhelm.
Mhm.
Things are clearer now because maybe we have a diagnosis, whereas before we had a question mark. But still, the inertia of having to go to the school and maybe the school accommodate, an IEP or an EHCP in the
Mhm.
UK, maybe they can put that into place and maybe the teachers can accommodate that and provide the sensory support that that child needs and all the other things you can do. Gosh, it's hard to know where to begin, and it often does feel like it falls on the parents' shoulders rather than the organizations around, and maybe that's unfair.
Yeah, in some ways, it is a little unfair. This is why I've written also about what do you do as a parent, because you do feel overwhelmed. And some parents also feel, I'll say, a sense of guilt because they did not know about the child ADHD and they were blaming the child. If you just tried harder, you could do better. And there are several steps, both for the parents watching this and the professionals. I always felt that it was important for a professional who either was doing the evaluation or is involved now uh, to really be one of the advocates. Now, this is just me. When I evaluate a child and there's diagnosis of ADHD, I always went up to the school to work closely with the school. I felt that in person dialogue could be so very helpful. And I wanted to take some of the burden off parents, but still they had to be very actively involved. Because I felt, they are having so many feelings now. What you brought up before in terms of what is the future going to be like? And will my child need help the rest of his or her life in that regard? So I certainly wanted to always help the parents, but I also felt it was very important to be a consultant to the schools. Now, if the parents do not have a professional who is going up to the schools or is not having contact, which I feel is very unfortunate, uh, then another great support is a parent support group. And it's interesting, based on your question, Patty, years ago, there was a big conference on ADHD here in the Boston area. And in advance of it, I was the keynote speaker in the afternoon. I actually gave out, it was a little questionnaire. What has been one of the most helpful things, for you in your journey with your child with ADHD? And I still remember one woman's comment. I smile about it now. She said, "It's not that I don't think you're very helpful, Dr. Brooks, because you and other psychologists and educators can be, but I found the most help attending a support group." And I saw that, Patty, when for years I was in the professional advisory board of CHAD, and I would talk to a lot of parents from all over the world, and they would talk about the input of other parents who have gone through this experience. And so I really more and more appreciated having a support group that could tell you, well, we went through this, or we went through this, or here's a professional who could be very helpful with that.
I like that because, yeah, that overwhelm partly comes because maybe for the first time we're having to hear words like executive function.
Yes.
There's the question around medication, which we're not going to talk about today, but is also something that's
Hmm.
presented to parents, and that can be quite a difficult decision to make.
Yes.
There's various therapy routes, and some of the therapies are quite different from the other
Hmm.
ones. There's occupational therapists who start bandying around words like proprioception and vestibular and all that kind of stuff. And it can be very helpful to talk to someone outside. I certainly find whenever I talk to a doctor, I never remember anything they say. I have to go and Google it later on. Dr. Brooks, Bob, I'm wondering because there's been quite a powerful movement, not just in ADHD, but also in areas like autism spectrum disorder, to kind of it's a theory, I guess, to present this as really like spectrum of human behavior or personality or temperament, which the system doesn't recognize, which is essentially defined as dysfunctional in regards to the system or to the culture's expectations. How sympathetic are you to that view?
Well, I certainly understand that view. I do believe that there have to be accommodations to the system, but what you're bringing up is a question that I've really struggled with over the years, and once even wrote about it is another conference on ADHD I was at. One of the speakers said, attended primarily by parents and professionals, said ADHD is a gift. And as long as we don't try to fit, a square peg into a round hole or something, then it would be fine. The way I try to look at it is you could view it not as a dysfunction, you could view it as the environment is not accommodating to your needs. And so I really try to sidestep it. I don't know how much to say. Yes, it is a wide spectrum. Look, with autism, we call it autism spectrum disorder. But in terms of that spectrum, there are certain expectations out there. There can be certain accommodations you could make. I think the world should make many more accommodations. As we saw with physical disabilities, in the past, when I was growing up, you didn't see sidewalks where there was, it was indented so that someone can, if that's the best word, could come in and, be able to traverse it with a wheelchair. So what I've said, and again, I don't know if it's sidestepping or whatever, is every kid has their strengths. Every kid has their beauties. Some kids' strengths fit in more with what the expectations are of the environment, and some kids do not. And then you have to look at how much can you accommodate. And I think as a society or any society, we should try to accommodate as much as possible in a way that helps that person who is struggling with whatever diagnosis it is to really become much more resilient. So I haven't gotten as much into the argument. I do see it as a spectrum. You could line up 10 kids with ADHD, and they would be very different. They might have the same symptoms. Well, to get that diagnosis, some same symptoms, but the extent of those symptoms and the environment they live in could be very different. So whenever I would work with either a child or adult with ADHD, my mind always was, okay, what is this person's strengths? When was the last time they experienced some success? What helped them in that particular thing? If I'm going up to the school, the same thing. What are the accommodations a school can make in that regard? And I have found over my career, which is very lengthy, I have found, one, that there are many accommodations that can be made that doesn't make the person feel like they are terrible in some way, and that there are things also the child can learn into their adult lives, coping strategies that are very effective for them. So maybe I sort of sidestepped your question a
No,
little. It's
I
just
don't
my
think you did.
way I understand.
I don't think you sidestepped it because, I've thought about this a fair bit and I still can't come to a particular conclusion because, yes, okay, we could say that there's a spectrum of personality, there's a spectrum of temperament, there's
Mm.
spectrums within the quote
Mhm.
disorders, unquote, but you still kind of have to function in society
Right.
anyway. In some countries at least, you legally have to pass through the education system. You can pick kind of the way you do it,
Hmm.
in some countries at least, but you still have to go through it. And
Right.
so you're accommodating in order to be able to pass through the system. On the other hand, I'm sure you've come across this. I certainly have. There are many parents making their kids' lives hell because they are not excellent or at least above average in a field in which they don't have that island of competence, as you've so famously put it.
Yes. This is a real problem, and this is why your very first question, in terms of getting the diagnosis, is so important. Uh, I've often written about accept your children for who they are rather than what you want them to be, which certainly sounds simple enough. But if a child has ADHD and has parents who have always thrived and done very well academically and have also excelled in sports, so I don't want to be overly simplistic about this. Then what happens is then they get a child who is not like they are, and let's say they also unfortunately have the mindset if my son or daughter tried harder, they could do much better. So what they're doing is they're actually then judging and accusing their child of something the child has no control over. And what does it do to the child? They get angry. They feel they've disappointed their parents. One child told me, "I know my parents don't like me because I am not acting in a way where they could feel like good parents." I mean, a very perceptive comment of a 12-year-old, and that particular 12-year-old was was right on target. And I certainly spoke to the parents about that. So parents have to think twice about, what are you saying to your child? And is it something that will not help the situation, but rather exacerbate some very strong negative feelings already? And I start with the assumption, I'm smiling about this as a parent myself, I start with the assumption that parents mean well, and that in many of the instances where I worked with many parents with kids with ADHD, some of it was just their own lack of understanding of what their child was going through. I would say to parents, to help parents, I think, understand things more fully, I said, imagine now during the appointment, I said to you, what, we really have to take a break and let's, exercise. We're going to run a mile. And I said, but we have to do it in 4 minutes. And you don't do it in 4 minutes. And I say, just try harder. And parents always laugh. And I said, but that's how your kid feels. And there are so many other examples I try to give. I also start with the assumption, and not every parent agrees with me, that from birth, every child truly wants to master his or her environment. In a book I wrote, Tenacity in Children, with Sam Goldstein, we talk about in that book how right from birth there are certain attributes, in empathy, compassion, fairness, that are already there at birth. And Robert White, a psychologist at Harvard in the 1950s, he was the one who said from birth there is a drive for effectiveness. And when I've worked with parents, I've tried to explain, I think it's in every child. Look at kids when they first are developing. I say, look at walking. Your child takes their first couple of steps, invariably they fall down. We would never think of saying to the child, if you tried harder, you could walk a longer distance in that regard. And I try to give images which will be helpful to the parents to realize, start with the assumption your kid is really doing as best they can, and you are, but that as best they can or as best as you can may need some modifications in what you do. I'm very careful. When I ask parents to be empathic towards their kids, I'm very careful, Patty, to be empathic towards them. Because if they feel I'm not being empathic towards them, then they're not going to hear anything I have to say.
And the cycle of unempathy carries on.
Yes.
So, Bob, what if I'm listening to this as a parent? I'm thinking, I get that, though, because my kid is great with animals and great at drawing, but I can't get them to focus in the class. The teacher's going crazy. I'm getting emails from the school every other week. Other parents are starting to, cold shoulder me a little bit. My kid's got that problem child reputation, and maybe there's even some behavioral problems in the class. Fine, I get the island of competence thing, but what the heck do I do here? Because I feel like I'm in firefighting mode.
Yeah, well, it is, it's in that frustration mode. There's no easy answer to the question you raised. One is, I think it's very important to validate what the parent or teacher is feeling, because some teachers or parents feel that people in their lives are not being empathic towards them. They minimize what the problem the parent is facing. Then what I try to do, and I'll talk in terms of my own practice, is, let's say in terms of some kids, and it gets to how much things could be accommodated. There are some kids you really have to have certain accommodations in place. I think, first of all, every school, this goes beyond ADHD, does not have enough physical, there are schools, I'll put it cautiously, there are schools that do not have enough physical activity for kids. And right away, then there's a mismatch between the school and expectations and the child. But there's something that we really have to think about. If the kid is really hyperactive, and we start with the assumption that kid cannot control staying seated. So then the way I pose it is, what is it we can do that will not disrupt the class? Then maybe other kids could do also. so that there's not that disruption. And just to give you a couple of examples, and again, every example is maybe very different. There was one boy, his big problem was during recess, he would get so active that he would just stay out there. And the teachers would say, he's not coming in. We call him, he's not coming in, he's not coming in, he's not coming in. And I hope this doesn't sound overly simplistic. And I said, well, why should he come in? Well, that's the rule. You have to come in. But I said, well, let's think of it this way. What purpose is there for him to come in, especially since he's struggling in school? And most teachers, they're intrigued by this. So with one boy, the 6-year-old, when they went out to recess, the teacher said to him, we need someone to hold the door when the kids come back in. And so she appointed him, and it's not always going to work this way. She appointed him the door holder. So he had to come in, she would call him, to hold the door so other kids could come in. Now, some people say, why did that work? Which it did. And I said, because one, he was given a responsibility. There was now a reason for him to be back there, and it was a very defined responsibility. There was a high school kid who, part of it, and in high school it's more difficult, but I worked with, that he actually would sometimes bring notes to the main office. But one of the things that helped in these cases is other kids also were allowed to do the same thing. So the kid holding the door, he had basically, it was like an associate, another kid who came in, so they both held the door. And, I know those may be overly simplistic in one sense, both of those examples, but what I feel is we have to look very carefully at what is the kid capable of. I never want to have low expectations and start with the assumption this kid is doing as best he can, and that this kid right now lacks certain skills to be able to meet the requirements here. I think it is, I've used this term a number of times because a parent once used it with me, prescription for failure. She said that, some things are just a prescription for failure. And thinking about that, I said, yeah, you ask a kid who cannot really meet the accommodations of the school or expectations of the school, it's a prescription for failure if you're expecting that kid to do so.
Certainly, if your solution is try harder and you just need to, and there's no other choice, which is something I can remember from my own childhood, speaking of someone who, as I mentioned before we started, got an ADHD diagnosis. And for me, it was a relief because I do remember many periods at school of being completely overwhelmed. I mean, particularly with maths, my head used to swim, and I think I had a physiological reaction, partly sort of feedback loop from the psychology of it all, that I would actually feel physically unwell looking at the maths. So my parents, with the best of intentions, doing the best they could for their kid with the information they had, got me more maths classes. So more of the stuff I couldn't do.
Yes. Well, it's like, I'm laughing, I shouldn't, but it's like when the kid doesn't finish his or her work, and the school keeps them in from recess. And I'm saying, this is a kid who needs so much physical activity, and you keep them in from recess. Their mindset and their mind is not going to be in a very good position to do work when you keep them in from recess. But that was one of the most common punishments. Keep them in from, for recess. When I would build in more recess, if you will. One of my toughest jobs, I think we've spoken about, was when I was principal of a school in a psychiatric hospital. And I learned quickly that there had to be more periods of recess or moving around because these kids, the maximum for some of them was like 20 minutes to a half hour, and they were out of learning mode, if you will. And then they would act up, and then we unwisely would have some form of punishment, which also kept them from physical activity. So one has to be very careful about that.
Talking about punishments, I mean, that was a leading psychological theory, wasn't it, around operant conditioning and punishments and rewards, and still a leading therapy, ABA, as you know. And there were a lot of other parenting techniques that came out of that, like timeout.
Hmm.
Taking things away, taking away screen time, still extremely popular and something that parents might have been using on their ADHD or their child without necessarily understanding the consequences of that. What's your position on timeouts, taking away and incentivizing through
Yeah,
rewards?
another important question. For me, and this is you're walking a tightrope, and then I'll tell you another story. You're walking a tightrope there. Sometimes there needs to be a timeout, but seen timeouts where a kid is sitting in school, say in the corner of a room. The problem is if a kid also at this point is exhausted and oppositional, you have to be careful using timeouts because if you say to a kid, "Well, you've got to go to your room now," then and the kid says, "I don't want to go to my room now," or then gets even more stubborn and says, "I'm not going to my room now." One has to think about what they can do with those points. I think sometimes it could be helpful with a young child to just pick them up, sometimes even stay with them or, rather than leave them. And then there was the mother. I'm back in this session. Sometimes when you may see me smiling, I'm thinking of that actual session uh, where she had a 10-year-old girl with ADHD and also was somewhat oppositional, the kid, almost because she didn't have great coping skills. And the mother would tell her, it was a single parent home, the mother would tell her, you have to go to your room. And I was doing a consultation with the mother, and the girl would say, no, make me. And invariably, it got worse. And I said, do you expect her at some point to say, thank you so much for sending me to timeout? She's not going to say that to you. So I said, what we have to think about, it's not working in this particular situation. Uh, and and I said, in the next session, we're going to talk a lot more about what else you could do instead. The mother comes in the next session, Patty, a big, broad smile on her face. She said, I couldn't stop thinking of something you said, that I have to basically change what I'm doing rather than my daughter. And she said, I thought of this, and I want to get your opinion, Dr. Brooks. She said, I said to my daughter, basically to diffuse the situation, she said, next time we get like this, it's not good for either of us. I'm going to take a time out. So the mother walks into her bedroom. Again, it's not always going to work like this. And the mother's sitting there. The mother said, I was concerned my daughter might trash the house, but she didn't, fortunately. And the mother's sitting there. All of a sudden, I'll say after about a minute or two, the mother said, there's a knock on her door. Her daughter is screaming, what are you doing in there? The mother said, I'm taking a time out. This is like a Hollywood ending. The girl says, can I join you? The mother says, as long as it's for a timeout. I think the girl was looking for a different way of handling it. The mother let her in. And actually the girl calmed down. They were both there. And what happened was the girl, looking at the being so quiet, actually started to giggle a little about that. Sometimes I've suggested to parents, you have to leave the arena at this particular point, that. But I think timeouts can be very helpful. I think sometimes they're overused. I think sometimes the moment there's a problem, you try to push your kid into another room. And this gets to another question. I know my answers are longer.
Take as long as
Yeah.
you want, Bob. We're not rushing today.
I've written a lot about prevention of problems. And during a calm period, have a little laryngitis, so some words may not come out smoothly. During a calm period, I think it's very important, and I've sometimes done it with a family in family therapy, to say sometimes we all get very upset. What should we do at those times? Because what you're doing is you're hopefully developing coping strategies. What should I do? Asking a parent asking a kid, what should we do? Not, again, that it's always going to work. But if in advance you can be preparing a child to use particular coping strategies that they suggested, that can start helping the child develop a greater sense of self-discipline, because that helps them to have these coping strategies. So during a real, I'll say, when the kid is totally burned out, is having a tantrum, the most important thing is to make sure there's safety in the house. But during those calm periods is when you can start to build up, certain coping strategies, as long as you make it a family issue, not just the child. We all have to figure out better ways of dealing with this. And I found that preparation can be very helpful. At first, it may take, may not work as effectively, but as one continues with the notion of coping strategies, it can start to be very.
You've just lit a little spark in my mind because I've just realized that by turning the time out on yourself, you're turning it into an effective way of, re-regulating, calming down, taking a breather,
Yes.
reflecting. And I've just realized the other thing I was talking about, which is taking your child's phone away, is actually really, or tablet, or computer games. It's actually a really good thing for mums and dads to do because it also takes us away from the digital noise and brings us to a place of calm.
Oh, definitely. Your questions keep triggering so many things in my mind. Here in the States, I don't know about in Europe, more and more schools, and not that it's a majority, if the kid comes in, they have to put their cell phone away. And I'm on the board of a school for kids who, struggle with learning and they have different diagnoses. But the head of the school and the staff this past school year, with the permission also and input of the parents, when the kid comes in, there's a little box, they put their cell phone, they cannot have it again till they have to leave. And at first, some of the kids were upset, obviously. Some parents were upset. Well, what if my child has an emergency? And that was easy enough for the school to say, well, we will call you. Within about a week, and a number of these kids have ADHD, within about a week, the, the head of the school said to me, the kids are relating more to each other. There seems to be less friction, better at, attending to things. So when you just mentioned that, that also means, of course, the teachers cannot be having their tablets, unless in schools it's sometimes tough because many schools now you're learning on tablets, but I still think there's a way of monitoring it. And there's another school I'm consulting with, which has a number of, I would say, the main population, kids on the autism spectrum, but higher on the autism spectrum. They're just going through that right now, that they feel the kids having their cell phone right in front of them has not been very helpful, and they're planning to do something after when the new school year begins.
So, first of all, that's definitely happening in Europe. It's a
Oh,
huge,
good.
huge thing, and the schools that are doing it are saying it's amazing what's happened.
Hmm.
So I still remember from the generation that first had mobile phones, 17 kids, 15 of whom were hiding those old phones, the little tiny screens behind their books whilst they pretended to read, and me and one other kid were talking to the teacher, and that was so I experienced that just as we left school. Actually, I was mentioning phone because partly in the context of if I threaten to take away my kid's phone, computer, tablet, I get them to do stuff, at least at home. And it's been working for a while, so I'm kind of reluctant. It's kind of coming back to that idea of taking that thing away as a punishment. You kind of covered it with timeout, but I'm wondering if maybe we can go back to that. I take the tech away, or maybe I yell and threaten to take the tech away. And that's the only way I can get my child to do their homework, do their chores, get out of the house on time.
Hmm.
I think you've kind of covered this, Bob, but I want to come back to that point because it's a very common question.
Well, it's very easy. Again, here's the smile I have. With my own son, Rich, who did no work. I might have told you about Rich.
Yes.
In the 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th grades. And I took everything away. I mean, I couldn't believe it, just everything away from him. And nothing really was working, but I still thought, because he felt homework was optional, and I did not, nor did his teachers, okay? Uh, so one has to look at how long is one trying this. For some kids, one can say, you know, and I believe this should be, and it's more difficult if they're doing schoolwork on their computers or tablets, that we have to work out a system. And like I've worked with some families in terms of the phone, where the families will say, look, you can have an hour on a tablet or so, 2 hours, non-school hours, an hour, say, on the tablet. Do you want to have it right when you come home from school or after you do your work? So I try to build in some choices that way. I also try to help kids see that is their decision. as long as we're not being overly punitive as parents, it's their decision. We're giving them choices, but it's their decision how they are going to respond. And it's not like kids are going to say, okay, I'm so glad to have the system, but I think we have to be firm as parents. The problem is when we take away all of these things. That's why I smiled when I thought about Rich. Someone once said, well, it was like a jail in his own house. I said, no, but it was a nice jail. But all the things we took, but it didn't work. It wasn't until I had to realize Rich has his own path in life. As long as he's meeting most of the requirements, even though he wouldn't do his homework a lot, by the end of the semester, he at least would get a C. I mean, he was basically a C student, and then he woke up because I woke up in the senior year when he had like an A- average. But he was on a different path, and school was not as important to him. Someone said to me once, a lot of people, what would you have done differently? I said, the first thing I would have done is not when I came home from work, ask him right away, did you do your homework? Because right away it sets up a very negative thing. Another thing, I would have told him more I love him. He's a very wonderful man. I would have told him I loved him. Because when I asked him if he did his homework, he always said yes, but he really hadn't done it. So that got me even more anxious. But I also love to involve kids, especially as they get older, in terms of problem solving. There is the problem with this. And I want to figure out with you, what do you think would be helpful? I still go back to Myrna Shore, who was a dear friend who died, and now a couple of years ago it is. Whole career, she was a psychologist in the Philadelphia area. Her whole career was spent on problem solving. And one of her books was Raising a Thinking Child, which really had to do with even preschoolers. And Myrna and I, we've had these conversations. I may have actually met her at a CHAD conference, if I recall correctly. And Myrna basically felt that if you focus on helping kids solve problems, involve them, even kids as young as 3 and 4, as long as they were verbal, they could start coming up with solutions. They may not be the greatest, but you could steer them in a certain way where they then had ownership for the problems. So with Rich, I really didn't do that. I made him, I'm so embarrassed to tell your audience, I made him sign over the 4 years like 15 to 20 contracts about doing his homework. None worked. And when we had a much better relationship, I said, well, Rich, why didn't the contracts work? And he said, I'll tell you why they didn't work. They were your contracts, not mine. You never really asked for my input. I said, but you signed them. He said, well, it was at least a temporary relief from hearing you say, do your homework. So I learned a great deal about that. And I would share that with parents who I was working with. Because in one workshop I gave about a couple hundred parents, so many of them came up afterwards and said, oh, we have a kid like Rich. And I said, you're very fortunate. Because he's turned out to be a very successful, man and a loving father. No, Rich got into the whole issue of media. He saw the web coming in the late 1990s, and now we live in the Boston area. He's 2 hours away in the Portland, Maine area, and he basically started. And now it has a lot to do with social media. They still do websites and things like that. The psychologist is my daughter-in-law, Suzanne.
Daughter-in-law. I apologize.
Yes.
Yeah, well, actually,
Yeah.
I'm glad you tell me that because he went on to become an innovator and disruptor.
Yes.
I think is what you're telling me.
I'll tell one more story since I'm opening up like this. I still remember the computers were first really coming in, and he spent hours making a birthday card for me on a computer, which was really amazing at that point. And then he also designed a program, a space game, very rudimentary, for kids with attentional problems. And when he gave it to me, unfortunately, I said, thank you so much. But this was when he was still in high school. But how come he's getting a warning slip in computer programming? That was my focus. Computer programming that they were having was so basic to him. But you're right, he could be more creative in that way. But I was really becoming estranged from him. And that was the shock. And I think we always have to ask as parents, are we becoming estranged from our own kids? We may not know what to do, but if we feel even if it's teenagers who often are finding their way to independence, if we feel that we're becoming estranged, then the techniques we're using, we really have to figure out other techniques, and sometimes with the assistance of a counselor who's knowledgeable about kids with ADHD.
And for everyone, I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that, Bob, because that takes a certain amount of courage as a parenting expert to be able to do that. Not every parenting expert does talk about their mistakes as well as their successes, but also for everyone watching, Bob's written, I think, 17 books by last count. More?
The 23rd is coming out
Oh my gosh.
in I think 2 months.
So there is no lack of reference and materials if you want to go deep on how to have a warmer and loving relationship with your
Yes.
kid.
That's why I'm very pleased that I had a son like Rich, because Doug did all his homework. I would have thought if I didn't have a son like Rich, just use all your techniques and kids will be motivated. All kids are motivated, but they're motivated towards different things. And I don't know if we ever spoke about this, Patty. The other thing is, when I mentioned the psychologist Robert White, who said there's a drive for effectiveness from birth, sometimes people have said to me, you were principal of school in a psychiatric hospital. Did those kids always do their work? Did they always, read the book or whatever? And they were good questions. And I said, no, but then I learned there's another motivation, which we all know, called avoidance motivation. Everyone is motivated, but unfortunately some kids use avoidance motivation. But why do they use avoidance motivation? They use it to avoid those situations in which physically or emotionally or cognitively exhausting, and so they just feel the only way they can cope is by using avoidance motivation, which then led me to say to parents and teachers, then instead of saying that this kid is unmotivated, what we have to ask is, what is it I could do differently as a parent, or what is it a teacher could do differently as a teacher, so that the kids will not have to rely on avoidance motivation. And that's really got me thinking about other strategies to use.
I love that. And that's also tying up to this idea of giving your child more responsibility. So I guess what you're saying is if you give them more responsibility, especially in an area where they have that internal intrinsic motivation, you're kind of unlocking the key to the child in some respects.
Yes, if one could do that, and one of the ways I have found very helpful, I just want to emphasize now, is I have found it very helpful that in giving the kids responsibility in an area they really can enjoy, but tying it to the act of giving can be very helpful. Like that young kid who held the door open. When you feel you're helping others is one of the greatest motivators at any point in our life. The problem is, when I go to schools and suggest that for a patient, some of them will say, well, why should we let the kid do this? They haven't done their work. And that led me to a whole different framework of saying, too often we'll say to kids, if you act this way, if you act dignified in school, we'll let you do these things. My whole approach became, first give these kids dignified things to do, and many or most will rise to the occasion. But not everyone bought into that. One teacher said to me, that's like spoiling kids. And I said, from my vantage point, and I try to be empathic, from my vantage point, it's not spoiling kids. Most of these kids have not tasted success in almost anything they've done. So give them that success. No preconditions. I'll let you do that. I'll let you tutor a young kid, if you're a high school kid, but only if you do your own work. First, help them, help to find a way that they can feel a sense of dignity in their world.
What if I'm a parent, I'm thinking, well, my kid wants to either be a gamer or an influencer. And I'm a little uncomfortable about those two subjects, partly because I don't know them, and because I perceive them to be sort of low value, basically waste of time. What would you say? Because I've heard that a lot from parents.
Yes.
I get the whole they've got a skill. It's just,
and of course,
it's a useless skill.
Right. Well, of course, also, why I'm smiling once again about is just having read a story about some of these gamers and influencers who, have like 1 million followers and actually are making a living with that. It's really like, for me, the same question is that when a kid would say to me who is not very well coordinated, I want to be a baseball player or whatever, I think one has to be careful of not just, throwing out the idea and saying this is ridiculous. I think what we have to do is actually say, well, that is one possibility, as long as, by the way, I have to add this. If being a gamer doesn't mean then staying on, a screen for 10 hours and you're in high school. So I think certain limits have to be set. But I think parents can say, I actually love what you said. I don't know much about this. Can you please tell me what is involved in this? I hear about gamers and influencers. Show some interest. Because if you right away say that's ridiculous and on, they're, with comments like that, they are not going to be very happy with us. And they're going to do it anyway. If we keep taking away the computer, they'll find other means to do that. So I always say, find some interest. And someone once said to me when I said that, well, what if my kid says I want to be a murderer? But I said, if they say that, that's another issue altogether. It could be. But most of the time, I want to be a gamer, I want to be an influencer, I want to be a professional baseball player. I mean, that's why there's so many ads, at least in the States, that only a certain small percentage of people even playing in college sports make it to the pros. But without kids, show some interest. Because one, if we show some interest, maybe we can learn much more about what their kid is interested in.
Yeah, and there's always going deeper. There's always some form of motivation
Mm.
behind it. Being the best in your peer group at a particular computer game is a very, very strong motivation for a
Mm.
teenager who, very hierarchy and social status
Yeah.
oriented. I'm also thinking about myself because I was in the first generation of people who were able to play online mass player, multiplayer computer
Oh,
games, which was very addictive when it first came
yes.
out. And when I talk with parents, I often remind them, look at me 20 years later. It hasn't turned out too bad. I hope you'll
No.
agree. But I certainly was capable of getting up at 3 in the morning and 4 in the morning and playing 12 hours straight without really pausing.
Wow.
Yeah, well, hence my university grades, which weren't so good. But yeah, it was a long
Yeah,
time
but
ago,
I
fortunately.
always tell people if you judge everything by a kid's grades, I mean, if you looked at my son Rich's grades, except in his senior year, you might not be able to predict where kids are going. Because Patty, it's what I said before and what I know you believe in. Every kid has their own path to take. It makes it more difficult for parents to figure out what that path might be, what their strengths might be. And that's why I always say to parents, when was the last time you saw your kid happy doing something? When was the last time you were happy interacting with your kid? With questions like that, so maybe we can learn a little more about what is it that brings some joy to you and to your child, and especially working together.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Brooks, I've just had a little weepy eye moment there because I'm thinking a lot of parents thinking, God, I've been making my child's life hell over their school
Hmm.
grades and the reports I've been getting back from the teachers
Yeah.
about their effort in class. And I've just realized I just don't have to be that parent for my child anymore.
No. And it's not easy when you're in the midst of any battle, as I said before. It's not easy. And I know that's why I tell a story about Rich. Here I am, supposedly, right, a parenting expert, and yet you fall into these traps. And a lot has to do with ourselves also. How could Bob Brooks, the expert on parenting, and motivation? I was writing about have a son who's not doing his work at school. But this also, see, I didn't look at his beauty or strengths. And again, I may have mentioned this in one of our interviews. Uh, he was president of the youth group in our town, and he was doing those computer programs. But see, I didn't see it as a strength. As I said before, I saw it as, well, why can't he then get good grades?
Um, Dr. Brooks, to what extent is some of the ADHD diagnosis really a reflection of our fragmented, hyperactive, consumerist, technologically obsessed culture that we have? In other words, if I was to put my kid through no fault of my own in front of 2 or 3 hours of screen time after school, maybe with some more screen time, I'd be generating a child with the same kind of fragmented, distractive, and inattentive behavior.
It's such a wonderful question, Patty. I'll put it this way, because someone said, were there kids with ADHD like 50 years ago, 60? And I remember when I was in training, I forget the exact year the diagnosis came in, but it was MBD, minimal brain dysfunction. I said these kids were here, but first of all, we have to think that many of these kids might have found an outlet in different ways. So the best answer I could give is I really think that this fragmented world and screen time or whatever could be used very effectively. I mean, some have argued that it could be very helpful to kids with ADHD, but I also feel very strongly that as we look at our frenetic world, it makes it much more difficult for kids in that world when parents are very busy, and they working and meeting their responsibilities, and kids. So I think the kids were there. I still think it's somewhat of people feel biological issue with a brain issue with kids with ADHD. Some don't feel that way, but I feel there's enough evidence of that. But what it really feels for me is that it's a world where it's not, if anything, it can reinforce that fragmentation, that lack of attentiveness, given the world kids are growing up in. I mean, when I think about just even in the last 20, 25 years, how things have changed, when and especially once the internet came in, the whole world is in front of you. If used effectively, it's very helpful. I mean, I could ask a question and get references for a topic I want to learn more about. But what that then makes us getting to I talk about personal control, is we have to ask ourselves, okay, if this is the world we live in, that's a given. We're not going to necessarily be able to change that. What is it that we can do so that we don't get caught up even more in this frenetic world where the attention spans are down to 15, 20 seconds? I remember when I used to be a regular on a TV show here in the Boston area, and the segments would be 7 minutes or 6 minutes, and I would say, that's such a short time for a topic. Now they're probably 2 minutes,
You can fit a lot of TikTok videos in 7 minutes.
That's exactly. I was thinking about that, and I used to complain about 6, 7 minutes. Sometimes when they were doing a special, I would have like 15 minutes or 20 minutes. But right, you go on TikTok; those are all very short things. So it's the world we live in, but we still have to think about is, okay, how do we accommodate to all of that's going on without giving up being an effective parent with our kids. Still, as you know, for me, resilience and almost everything else is based on the relationships we have. And so as parents survey their, say, a week in their life as a parent, the time they're spending with the kid, what are the activities they're spending? And I'll often ask parents to do that. What are the activities? And yes, you're very busy, but what are the activities with young kids? I always say to parents, you know what? Have a special time with your kids when you're reading to them and say, this is a special time. Even if I get a phone call, I won't answer it. And as ridiculous as that may sound, one girl once said to me, a young girl, I know my parents love me because they don't answer the phone when they're with me, which was such a beautiful, poignant, I thought, example of a 7-year-old saying that. How
Yeah,
they
that's
notice.
amazing. How much time should we be spending with our ADHD children and children generally? If we are busy, but we've got, 2-ish hours in the evening altogether.
Yeah, well, every family's different. I was very fortunate that I could come home from the hospital in time to have dinner. My wife and I had, unless rare exceptions, were able to have dinner with Rich and Doug almost every night. I have also an office in my house, which made it easier. When the kids were very young, I had patients in the evening. Some of my adult patients were in the evening. So I found even just having that time to be with them for a little while at dinner was very important. The other thing is when they were teenagers, I would take one out. And again, if I told the story, forgive me, but I would take one of them out for lunch, just at a hamburger place, dinner, I mean, at a hamburger place. One Wednesday, I still remember it was Wednesday night, I don't know why, and another the next Wednesday, just to have more time to spend with them. And I didn't know how important it was. And I remember Rich saying, as long as we go out and you don't mention school. And I said to him, that's fine. I don't want to get indigestion. But this is the point I want to make about that. You think it's helpful. And we had great conversations, nothing about school. But when Rich went to college, he did get his grades up, went to college. When he went to college, I still remember the first time he came home of, I forget what vacation, might have been. But one of the first things he said to me, Patty, is, are we still going to have dinner on Wednesday night? So I said, wow, it was important to you. He said, it was very important to me. So that hour and a half sitting just with Rich and sitting just with Doug, and there were times we went out as a family, certainly, but that was such a special time to him. And so for me, it's often not necessarily in terms of the hours, it's the moments you create, those special times. And I enjoyed it a great deal, but I never knew the impact until he came home from college. And he recently, I forget why, he mentioned it to me again recently, how important that was.
I'm sure many people can connect to that. Bob, I want to kind of set myself this very difficult goal of somewhat summarizing what you've told me, and you tell me if I've got this right.
Okay.
So my child has had an ADHD diagnosis. It's the confirmation, the relief, maybe the start of a new journey. I'm a little bit nervous. What I've heard from you today is that my child's unique, that they have islands of competence where they're actually going to be effective. And if I give them responsibility, particularly in an area where they have an island of competence, I'll probably unlock something in them. If, on the other hand, I use force and pressure, particularly with their schoolwork, I'm probably going to get the exact opposite reaction. So I'm going on this journey kind of seeing my child as they actually are and not who I wanted them to be. And in the process, I'm discovering a lot about myself as a parent, because I'm realizing, exactly as you said today, I'm part of this dynamic. The child is not the problem child with the ADHD, but actually part of the function of the unit we have together. So my own journey as a parent is self-compassion, self-reflection, working on how I work with the child and not just how I get the child to change. And I hope this is the right message, and I think it probably is, relax, everything's going to be fine in the end. Is that a good way of putting it?
I loved everything you said. You should, I could use you to write my summaries of talks. I, in terms of relax, what I tell parents is it may be difficult to relax. So I put that in there. It may be difficult to relax. Find some things that are related to self-care that are helpful to you, whether it's meditation or going for a run or whatever it might be. So I do like to tell parents it's going to be difficult to relax, but I also want to offer realistic optimism. And realistic optimism isn't just false optimism. I like to say, if we're able to find that relationship and help our child to accommodate, and the world accommodates our child when they're certainly growing up, I'd like to say there are so many kids with a diagnosis of ADHD actually do very well in life. And so I would just add that to what you said. It was one of the greatest summaries I've heard. There.
Well, thank you. Had some good materials to work from. So we'll have plenty of links to Dr. Brooks's materials. His multiple two-figure books, 23 and counting. Not the end, I'm sure. Thank you very much, Bob, for spending this time with us, and I'd love to speak to you again.
Oh, I'd love to speak with you again. As I've said to you, it's so delightful to be interviewed by you. So thank you for having me on again.
Thank you very much.